What happens when the world's most powerful leader declares a trade war on African nations? It's not just a headline or a political move. It's a seismic shift that sends shockwaves through economies, industries, and communities across an entire continent. Tariffs may sound like dry economic jargon, but for millions of Africans, they translate into lost jobs, rising prices, and uncertain futures. We'll take you beyond the numbers and policies to reveal the real human stories behind the statistics. From factories slowing down to small businesses struggling to survive, Donald Trump's tariffs are reshaping Africa's economic landscape in ways few expected. But why target Africa? And how are these tariffs influencing Africa's role on the global stage? Join us as we unpack the complexities of this trade war, the winners, the losers, and the countries scrambling to adapt. This is more than a story about economics. It's about power, resilience, and the fight for Africa's future in a rapidly changing world. Welcome, and today we will address a pressing issue that is having a profound impact on the economic stability of African nations. The tariffs imposed by Donald Trump are far from just political rhetoric. They are tangible barriers that threaten to undo years of progress by putting thousands of jobs at risk across diverse industries. From manufacturing and agriculture to textiles and technology, these tariffs don't just affect big corporations. They trickle down to everyday people, workers losing their lives, families struggling to make ends meet, and entire communities facing uncertain futures. Countries that rely heavily on exports to the United States are now forced to rethink their trade strategies, seeking new markets or facing economic downturns. In this exploration, we'll break down exactly how these tariffs are calculated, why Africa became a target, and what this means for the continent's role in the global economy. We'll also look at specific examples, such as Lesotho's unique challenges, to understand the real-world consequences behind the numbers. Join me as we uncover the complex layers behind this trade conflict, the causes, the effects, and the possible paths forward for Africa's economic resilience. On April 2nd, former U.S. President Donald Trump made an announcement that would ripple across the globe: reciprocal tariffs on imports from 180 countries. The measure, framed as a way to restore fairness in international trade, was positioned as a bold move to protect American industries. But behind the political messaging, the real question emerged. What does this mean for countries that depend heavily on exports to the U.S.? Nowhere is this impact more complex and more overlooked than in Africa. For decades, many African nations have exported raw materials, agricultural products, and low-cost textiles to the United States under preferential trade agreements, These agreements aim to stimulate development by opening U.S. markets to African producers. But Trump's new tariffs shifted the ground beneath their feet. The logic behind these new duties was based on trade imbalances. In simple terms, countries that export far less to the U.S. than they import are now facing higher tariffs. This calculation, while seemingly neutral on paper, disproportionately penalizes developing nations, especially in Africa, that don't have the capacity or infrastructure to maintain large export flows. Let's break that down. Imagine a country like Lesotho exporting textiles to the U.S., but importing fuel, machinery, and food. According to Trump's system, this gap, importing much more than it exports, is seen as an unfair advantage against the U.S., and thus punished with steeper tariffs. But in reality, these are structural inequalities, not strategic trade manipulation. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about power and who gets to write the rules of global trade. And for many African nations, it marked the beginning of a new era, one where even long-standing allies like the United States could impose measures with devastating consequences without warning, and with little regard for the fragility of the economies affected. Let's zoom in on a country that's rarely in global headlines, but now finds itself at the center of a trade storm. Lesotho, a small landlocked nation entirely surrounded by South Africa. At first glance, Lesotho might seem like an unlikely victim of international economic policy. With just over 2 million people, it lacks the industrial power or global influence of larger African economies. Yet, when Trump's tariffs were rolled out, Lesotho was among the hardest-hit nations on the continent. Why? Because Lesotho's economic survival depends heavily on exports, especially in the textile and apparel industry. For years, under agreements like Agoa Lesotho, became a hub for clothing manufacturers supplying major American brands. This sector alone provides tens of thousands of jobs, particularly for women, a lifeline in a country where formal employment is scarce. But Lesotho also imports far more than it exports, especially essentials like food, fuel, and equipment necessities it cannot produce at scale. And under Trump's new reciprocal tariff formula, this trade imbalance was seen not as a structural challenge, but as a justification for economic punishment. The consequences were swift. Tariff hikes on Lesotho's apparel exports made its products less competitive in the U.S. market. Orders were canceled, factories downsized, and entire production lines halted. for a country already battling poverty, high unemployment, and limited infrastructure. This wasn't just a policy shift, it was a direct hit to its economy. And the people felt it first. This is the human face of macroeconomic policy. Behind every tariff percentage point, there's a worker losing a job, a child missing a meal, a community losing hope. And yet, Lesotho's case is just one of many, a warning sign of how fragile the balance is for developing nations caught in the crossfire of global economic decisions made oceans away. These tariffs are not just lines in a trade agreement or numbers on a spreadsheet. They're real forces shaking the economic foundations of an entire continent. Across Africa, industries that once thrived on trade partnerships with the United States are now facing sudden pressure. Jobs are disappearing, factories are scaling back, and small businesses that depended on export revenue are being pushed to the brink of collapse. Take the textile industry not just in Lesotho, but in countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Madagascar, where American demand once sustained entire production hubs. Now, with higher tariffs and reduced orders, many of these plants are cutting hours, laying off workers, or closing entirely. And it doesn't stop there. Agricultural sectors are suffering too. Countries that once exported niche crops, coffee blends, or specialized goods to the U.S., are now watching those same products become economically unviable due to rising costs and market uncertainty. Let's look at the numbers. In just the first 6 months after the tariff announcement, several African countries reported job losses in the tens of thousands. Unemployment rates in export-reliant regions spiked by 6 to 12%, depending on the country. And for workers, this isn't just about losing a paycheck. It's about losing dignity, purpose, and the ability to support a family. For small business owners, it's about shuttering shops they built over decades. For governments, it's a rising pressure to stabilize economies with fewer tools at their disposal. I had 12 workers, now I only have 2. My son had to drop out of school. We're not just losing money, we're losing hope. These economic shocks don't stay local for long. They ripple outward into education, healthcare, and long-term development. What began as a political maneuver by a world power has become a crisis of opportunity for millions. And as industries shrink and investments slow, Africa is being pushed to redefine its trade strategies, often without the time or resources to adapt. This is the silent cost of tariffs, the invisible toll they take on dreams, futures, and entire generations. Why did Lesotho, a small landlocked nation, get hit with some of the harshest tariff rates, while larger African economies like South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya seem to get off lighter? At first glance, it might seem arbitrary, but when you dig deeper, a clearer and more troubling picture emerges. It all comes down to 2 key factors. 1. The imbalance in import-export volumes. 2. The specific categories of goods subject to U.S. tariffs. Lesotho, with its modest economy, exports far less than it imports. And much of what it does, export textiles, clothing, and niche manufactured goods, falls directly under the categories now hit hardest by the U.S. tariff structure. In contrast, South Africa and Nigeria have broader trade portfolios, diversified economies, and, in some cases, more leverage in negotiating trade terms due to their geopolitical influence and access to alternative markets. But there's more. Lesotho has long benefited from trade agreements like the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a pact that allowed African countries to export to the U.S. With Trump's new tariff policy, many of these benefits were suspended or overridden, hitting nations like Lesotho, especially hard nations whose economies relied heavily on that very privilege to stay competitive. So while countries like Kenya or South Africa could absorb the impact through diversified exports and alternative trade routes, Lesotho faced a brutal economic shock like a small boat caught in a global storm with no sail, no anchor, and no escape. This discrepancy reveals a deeper truth. Tariffs don't just punish nations, they expose vulnerabilities. And in this case, Lesotho became the symbol of how imbalanced global trade can lead to disproportionate consequences where size, volume, and visibility determine whether a country drowns or stays afloat. And the big question now is, how will nations like Lesotho adapt, or will they be left behind in a world increasingly shaped by political deals and economic power plays? Trump's tariffs didn't just impose new costs, they disrupted lives, industries, and diplomatic relations across the African continent. What began as a move toward fair trade quickly escalated into economic shockwaves that many African countries were unprepared for. Factories slowed down. Exports declined. Jobs vanished almost overnight. Entire sectors, especially in nations heavily reliant on textile and low-margin exports, found themselves at the mercy of a new global order, where political power dictated economic survival. But in the face of adversity, Africa is not standing still. Nations across the continent are pushing back not with confrontation, but with strategy. They're diversifying trade partners, seeking new markets in Asia, Europe, and within Africa itself. They're retooling supply chains, investing in local production, and, in some cases, entering into direct negotiations with U.S. trade representatives to restore some of the lost advantages. What we're witnessing is more than a reaction, it's a transformation. Africa is recalibrating its place in the global trade system, navigating a path between vulnerability and resilience. And while the future remains uncertain, one thing is clear. The continent is no longer content with being a passive recipient of global policy decisions. It's learning, it's adapting, it's responding. This is an unfolding story, one of politics, power, and perseverance. And here at Depth, we'll be here to follow it every step of the way. If this video opened your eyes to a side of global trade you don't usually see, don't let the story stop here. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm this content matters. Leave a comment. Your voice adds depth to the conversation. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Depth, where we dive beneath the surface of headlines to bring you the human, political, and economic truths shaping our world. Got a friend who's into geopolitics, economics, or just likes understanding how the world really works? Share this video with them. You never know whose perspective you might change with a simple click. Thanks for being here with us. Stay curious. Stay informed. And as always, we'll see you in the next chapter.